Works. Now we're live. Did that help?
It says you can't start the video because the host has stopped it.
Huh. Ooh, interesting. All right, let me figure that out. I didn't stop any video, so this is interesting. All right, someone's typing, so let's see what they say. How are we feeling about the presentation?
I'm excited.
Yeah, me too.
Cool. All right, hold on. I'm gonna talk to this person. All right, that worked. Sorry about that. Let's see. So we have 2 attendees here. Okay. We'll just give another minute, I think, for people to join. Good to see everybody. So Andi couldn't make it, so we're only gonna have 3 presenters today. All right. Well, I guess we'll just get started. So again, everyone will go for their 10 or 12 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A for a few minutes after that, so we can ask questions and hear from you all. Our first presenter is Hailey O'Donnell from journalism, and they will be doing their LOI presentation, Flowers by the Sea, Sylvia Plath and Sexton, and the misunderstood young women who carry them. Please welcome Hailey O'Donnell.
All right, hey everyone. Let me get to my share screen, and then I will move it to present mode. Alrighty then. Okay, well, hey everyone, and welcome to my presentation of, like Brian just said, Flowers by the Sea. I'm really excited that y'all are here today. It should be really fun. These are topics that are really close to my heart and that I had a really fun time researching. So yeah, I wanted to start out with a little bit of an anecdote from my 15-year-old self from my journal back in 2016. This is an April 1st entry, and it's the first one in my journal. So I wrote, "A new beginning, a chapter that holds what I can only hope to be some dramatic plot twist. Please help me never to judge myself in this sanctuary, to let my mind spill nowhere but into the pen. I've always felt misunderstood. I don't blame most. I don't understand myself. Paper. I'm hoping paper will understand me. I want to give my secrets and observations and tales to no one but paper." So moving forward. Okay. There we go. So why talk about Sylvia Plath and Sexton, or more generally, why did I come to this research topic and this line of inquiry? Well, for me, one of the most important reasons to talk about Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath is to recognize and investigate the space that they've created within poetry for young women to discuss disillusionment from the demands of expected womanhood. And I'll explain those terms a little bit, how I define them more later. But in general, I have analyzed how Plath and Sexton have displayed both a willingness to discuss their feelings of disillusionment, disenchantment from these conventions of femininity and womanhood in society, and also how they aim to challenge it through their work. I also discuss how it's vital to not dismiss young women's creative work as simply dramatic or angsty work, and rather to encourage young women to speak the unspoken and to break their silence regarding their experiences, and particularly how Plath and Sexton have helped forge a path for a lot of young women to do this, and also to sort of discuss the societal mistakes and miscarryings in their legacies, and how we can see some of these like negative attitudes about women discussing mental illness or mental health issues in creative work in young creative women today, and how we can maybe remedy and create new paths that are more sustaining for creative work from young women in the future. And then also just to form new legacies about Plath and Sexton, which I argue within my work that it's less of a legacy by the book and more of an energy or a spirit that flows through and within these new leagues of young creative women as they share their voices with each other. I became interested in this topic very personally because I've always been a Plath and Sexton reader and lover, and I've always been interested in the ways that we as a society sort of dismiss or discourage creativity in young women via shame or guilt about the work not being serious or good enough. And so I wanted to investigate how their legacies can reveal how we can have better approaches to mental health in young women and also just supporting creativity in young women. So to move on from there, my essential thesis or focus was that the true legacy of Anne and Sylvia is nothing you can write about. Rather, it's an energy that lives in the souls of the young women that continue to assuage and inspire. It belongs to them. Sexton and Plath have shaped poetry as a vehicle for women to examine an experience of womanhood marked by mental health concerns, feeling misunderstood, darkness in general, disillusionment with the demands of expected womanhood. Their legacies implore us to develop more attentive and empathetic approaches to mental health in young women. So just kind of synthesizing what I've already been starting to explain. And then, like I mentioned before, I wanted to quickly define some key terms sort of as I define them for my research. So for purposes of my work, I define disillusionment as a sensation of pervasive disappointment and or reckoning with reality's shortcomings. So sort of the differences between what an individual is sold and what they actually receive that can generate intense discomfort, loneliness, disbelief, and hopelessness. And then I just define expected womanhood basically as a term I use to encapsulate the cultural and social elements of American life that enforce these ideals of what womanhood should be. So basically like standards. And so in relation to each other, disillusionment from expected womanhood can look like a sort of aversion to, or in some cases, as we'll see, rebellion against the reality of an individual's entrapment in an oppressive situation. And it can take many forms. So I'll sort of just kind of jump into how I see it in Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton's poetry. I sort of discovered that it plays both the role implicitly, meaning through the use of poetics to create a disillusioned atmosphere that sort of mimics a lot of the sensations of disillusionment, and explicitly by discussing gender roles, motherhood, beauty standards, stuff like that. A really perfect example of this is The Applicant by Sylvia Plath, which has always been one of my favorite poems. And in the poem, the speaker is this sort of super salesman, as Plath once describes him. And the woman in the poem becomes, or is, not even a woman at all, really, but a product. This thing to, as you can see in the first line, fill the emptiness. I have the ticket for that. So right away, it's the commodification of this woman in the poem. They're described as a living doll, which I always think is a really interesting part because it's the recognition of sentience while also it being a doll, a thing you can pose, and that doesn't have its own agency. Sort of, I think, kind of coyly recognizing the absurdity of a lot of the standards about womanhood, especially around the time when Plath was writing this. But truly where the disillusionment is shown too is how the woman in the poem is marginalized to the very edges of the poem. They don't really have a voice or any authority to sort of corroborate these experiences that the speaker is selling us. Like the "it works, there's nothing wrong with it" doesn't leave us any room to interrogate if that's true or not. And you can see that they're in a closet in the poem also. And just in general, as well, the poem mimics disillusionment through our inability to control the situation, also the woman's inability to control the situation. Throughout the poem, the tone becomes a lot more like urgent and panic, and a lot of that's created through the use of repetition and the speed kind of increasing towards the end, which creates this claustrophobia that sort of mimics like a sensation of being in a reality that you feel you have no way out of. So it starts to feel like it's all closing in on you, which I argue mimics the sensation of living in a society where you feel like there's all these things, burdens on your back that you can't really have a means to fix. And a similar thing occurs in Self in 1958 by Anne Sexton. I'll just kind of briefly go over this one. They place us in this very bizarre space in the poem. First of all, the speaker refers to themselves as a doll, so that's like another recurring similarity to the speaker in The Applicant. But also there's all these objects that are just like slightly off center. So a cardboard floor, a flat roof, a counterfeit table. We're placed in this space that's just like these items sort of seem like props because they've been taken, all their context has been taken out of it. And so it creates this like space where reality is really skewed, which I think also mimics the sensation of disillusionment, and then also the dehumanization through them being a doll and by like someone's playing with them, like it's highlighted at the start of the second stanza, but we don't know who. And then also I thought this was important to bring up because it deals with like a sensation of surrender that I talk about a lot in conjunction with disillusionment, where towards the end of the poem they say, I would cry if I could remember how and if I had the tears, sort of denoting that they're trapped in this reality that they really feel they have no control over, and even their ability to mourn has been stolen from them. So they really don't even have ownership of their own reality. So that question of what is reality has sort of lost a lot of meaning. Anyway, so that's just sort of the base of what disillusionment can look like, and kind of explaining more what I mean by it when I talk about it and like the sensation of it. Now moving into the importance more broadly of taking this disillusionment and directing it towards a means of creative catharsis and healing. So more generally, just for like young women in general and young writers in general, Susan England, Carol Ganser, and Carol Tassone note that in many narratives of depression, the authors will refer to their suffering as something unspeakable. And it's that feeling of profound isolation that can compound the suffering and make it feel like, well, there's nothing, like I can't speak to anyone about it because I can't explicate it and there's no one to talk about, like you feel like you're alone in your experience. So then it follows, and they follow that being able to put this into words can be something that's very healing for both the person themselves, and I argue that for the community, because it sort of de-isolates the suffering and makes it more of like a cultural phenomenon. So Plath and Sexton definitely broke ground in this department by speaking to their experiences of disillusionment directly, and then also using tools of poetic rebellion to sort of challenge the expected womanhood standards that can create these sensations. And a great example of that really quickly is Lady Lazarus, very famous poem by Plath. The speaker references expected womanhood throughout the poem. They're discussing their experience with suicide and the aftermath of their attempts. At one point, they describe the worms on their body as sticky pearls, stating that they're a smiling woman, only 30. All these things kind of denoting a perceived fall from the graces of desirability socially. And these societal graces are a character that the speaker is interacting with sort of throughout the poem. And they're sort of personified as this peanut crunching crowd who's clamoring in for the big striptease. So their experience is something that's sensationalized and commodified rather than met with true empathy and understanding. But really where we see the tools of subversive poetics here is through the use of voice. Throughout, it's this jeering, assured, prideful voice, especially towards the end. And we kind of see, like with the beware, beware, or the oh, my enemy, do I terrify, how they're aware of what they've been made to become, what their caricature has become in society, and they're making strides to recharacterize themselves. And especially towards the end with the famous I rise with my red hair and I eat men like air, recognizing that one of the greatest fears of the people who are perpetuating the tools of expected womanhood is a woman deviating from these expectations. So sort of recognizing that their deviation from what is seen as like what a woman should be is something fearful, and turning that into like a horror drama imagery, but where they have the power and they have the control in that situation, and they are the agent of fear and of power. So moving on from that, just more generally, more on that subject of speaking the unspoken, Ariel Greenberg and Becca Klaver suggest that what young women crave is the ability to see themselves in the culture and the culture in them, and to see their own symptoms as cultural symptoms. And I kind of expanded in my research to argue that they also have a desire to see themselves in each other and each other in themselves, and that through poetics, it can be a really effective strategy in realizing this desire, not only personally by being able to discover new senses of self, but also the ability to share this like formerly unspeakable experience. And like Susan Hart says here, speaking the unspoken, they're able to welcome themselves into a community of people that also feel this way. And with that, I also want to get to what we see as the true legacy of Plath and Sexton. So kind of briefly, I could like talk a lot longer about how their legacy has been misconstrued and mishandled by culture at large. But in general, like Heather Clark writes in her intro to Red Comet that Sylvia Plath has become this paradoxical symbol of female power and helplessness whose life has been subsumed by her afterlife. She's been called a snake lady of misery by the Washington Post, a muse of teen angst by Psychology Today. So in general, Plath and Sexton both have these legacies that are very sensationalized, and it's a problematic approach because it takes these women away from both their personhood and their artistry in their total senses. Yes, including their experience with mental health, but also including their triumphs and their approaches in their work on a variety of subjects. So anyhow, it's not uncommon also for young women to feel similarly that their work is going to be dismissed or only made out to be something that's just like an angsty or like a dramatic approach in their work, and it can make them feel ashamed of their emotionally honest creative expressions, often afraid that their efforts will be written off as like whiny, corny, typical teen angst. And Susan Hart raises the question, how do we give adolescent girls the courage to say the next hard thing when their poetry, and by extension their very experience, has been labeled as teen angst? And while this question is something that remains uncertain, I argue that in the meantime, Plath and Sexton are very comforting figures in women who are dealing with this and feeling this emotion, because they've shown how other women can have these experiences and talk about them, and it can be something cathartic and healing for a whole community of women who feel similarly. And I argue in my essay that their legacy is an energy and a spirit that is passed along through these women who are experiencing these things, because the affinity between a Plath reader and Plath, or a Sexton reader and Sexton, is something that goes beyond what you can put down on a page or discuss in analysis. It's a deep bond that can be something that's like very reaffirming and can be in many times the first time a woman feels like really validated in her experiences and the ability to discuss her experience. So then through that cycle of a woman feeling confident enough to discuss her experience and work, the legacy is then in effect carried on and passed along interpersonally and also just through the work itself. And then moving on to conclusions, because I know I'm tight on time. In conclusion, basically by creating with the intention to interrogate this emotional way of disillusionment, young women can discover both new senses of self and new senses of their world. And they can see that their emotions are legitimate symptoms of a culture that is just frankly inapt to adequately support young women. And hopefully with investigating this and creating new legacies for Sylvia and Anne, we can understand how we can have better approaches to both mental health in young women and how to support creativity in young women. And just really quickly too, as a writer, I always aim to investigate the profound subversive energy of young womanhood, particularly as it emerges through isolation. That's kind of one of my main things I like to think about. So this was really helpful in sort of returning me to my roots, definitely with like looking through my old journals and stuff and understanding why and how creativity matters to young women and why the process itself is just as important as the outcome. And I would say also, if I were to offer advice for other people in the future, thinking about what legacies you're carrying on as you write is something that I think I've learned through this experience, and I think can be a really important approach to writing. And also just returning to the self that fell in love with writing by reading the writers that made you fall in love, reading your old journals, and really trying to understand why the process is important and the work that you're carrying on by doing what you're doing, no matter where the poem ends up. And then super quickly, I wanted to end as I began with a final word from my journal. This one is from when I was 16, and it's the last entry in the same journal that I read the first entry from. So I wrote on August 3rd, 2017. When I began this journal, I hoped it would aid me in feeling less misunderstood, less hopeless, less frantic. But in the end, an empty journal is not the answer. Yes, it is cathartic. It is simply a mechanism, a mirror. It is a reflection of transportation. It is not me, it is a messenger of me, and there are still so many elements to be delivered. These pages saw me change, they saw me dismal, they saw me radiant, they saw me fall in love. And although I am critical of these pages, they are magnificent. They are magnificent because they are raw and because they make sense, to me, if no one else. Isn't that all that matters? And that's the end.
All right, thank you, Hailey, so much. Very interesting. Fantastic. All right. Our second speaker is Amelia Hamerlynck from Anthropology, who will be presenting a paper titled "Her Body Was a New and Ancient Rite: Contemporary Queer and Women plus Poets Rewriting Ancient Greece." Please welcome Amelia Hamerlynck.
Hello. Sorry. Okay. So, my paper was entitled "Her Body Was a New and Ancient Rite," which that is a quote from one of the poetry books that I'll be discussing, Hold Your Own by K. Tempest. And my subject matter was how contemporary queer women and non-binary poets rewrite ancient Greece or incorporate themes of ancient Greece into their poetry. Similarly to Hailey, I think this kind of partly came out of a personal obsession or a personal love of poets who do stuff like this, and also my own work in which I've incorporated these themes. And so starting off, I just want to talk about kind of the framework with which I approached analyzing these poems. And so I first need to talk about the canon, which, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, the idea of the canon is that there's this group of texts that are considered to be the most important, the most integral, the most worthy of study and preservation. And of course, many of these texts are genuinely deeply affecting, deeply important, significant to world history, and very much hold up today in terms of their emotional impact and their value. However, it's also undeniable that the canon is specifically designed to tell a certain story. And this one that I'm referring to is the story of Western civilization, this idea of ancient Greece as kind of a birthplace of a lineage, which is this history of countries that are non-coincidentally now considered to be racially white, considered to be rational, Enlightenment inspired, democratic. And, you know, as much as somebody can love ancient Greek culture and texts, it's kind of undeniable how the history of their preservation is deeply linked to this concept that's extremely white supremacist, which is ironic because there was no concept of race in ancient Greece. And so this really important question that a lot of people have been asking, especially since the advent of postmodernism after the Second World War, is this question of how do you overhaul the canon? How do you kind of interrogate and debunk and undermine a lot of these different aspects of what we consider to be important and integral literature. And there are lots of ways you can go about overhauling the canon. One of them is expanding it to include more voices. So for instance, the assertion that, you know, Aztec and Mayan mythology and ancient mythology from all parts of the world are just as important as ancient Greek mythology and should be treated with the same respect and dignity and interest, and not with a bias towards one type of study. And then there's also this idea of like rewriting the canon, and that's mainly where my research focused, because I think you can make the argument that most of the poets who I'm going to be talking about were doing this postmodernist act of rewriting. And what's really interesting about rewriting as a concept is that it's very ambivalent. On the one hand, if you rewrite a text, you're critiquing it in some way because you're saying there's a way in which it could be improved. There are elements of it that should be questioned or subverted. But on the other hand, if you rewrite a text, you're basically reaffirming that it's important, because you're saying this is an important enough thing for me to care about that I would go through the effort of rewriting it. And so it's kind of that duality of reaffirmation and disrespect or evisceration or critique that a lot of these poems exhibit simultaneously. And what I find especially interesting about that ambivalence is the fact that the subject matter is also in itself somewhat ambivalent. You know, obviously a lot of the critique in the poetry I'm going to be talking about has to do with gender and the fact that we tend to pedestal and praise ancient civilizations that were deeply patriarchal and never centered the voices of women. On the other hand, there are many characters, female characters in Greek mythology who are considered extremely strong and have kind of retroactively been labeled as feminist in some way because of their strength and their power. On a similar note, there's the fact that like part of the pedestaling of ancient Greece has to do with the furthering of white supremacy. But like I mentioned earlier, the concept of race didn't exist in ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks didn't consider themselves to be white. And so there's like this power in reclaiming an era of history before the modern concept of race. And so those are all interesting things that I was considering while evaluating some of the poetry. So I'm just gonna go right into the poems that I mainly analyzed in my essay. The first one that I talked about was Memorial, which is a version of Homer's Iliad by Alice Oswald. And this is basically a series of eulogies for every named death in the Iliad, which is the Homeric epic about the Trojan War. And so this author specifically is talking about named deaths regardless of their significance in battle, regardless of whether they were heroified or well-known. And because of this like onslaught of eulogies that's explaining all of these deaths of minor soldiers, minor characters, it kind of shifts the gaze of the Iliad from a story about hero cults, which was an extremely important part of ancient Greece, to being a story about the absurdity of warfare, especially as it relates to constructions of masculinity, which is a very obviously kind of post-feminist gaze or lens to look at this, because this hero cult that was normalized at the time period and made sense at the time is now considered a really important part of toxic masculinity. And so Oswald definitely does this kind of subtly, but it's like a very obvious overriding theme throughout the work. Kind of on a similar note, the other retellings or rewritings of the Homeric myths that I talked about are The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. This is a novel that tells the story of the Odyssey from Penelope's perspective, but there are large portions written in verse. And the parts written in verse are Greek chorus narratives that are sung by the slave girls who belong to Penelope and Odysseus. And famously, none of these girls were named except for one of them. And so they were kind of this faceless collective of women who got like punished by the narrative for having been raped by suitors who were pursuing Penelope and attacking Odysseus's palace while he was returning home to Ithaca. And so it's like specifically giving a voice and agency to this group of women who would never have been given any type of agency in the original ancient Greek texts and in the canon. And kind of the overarching point of this book is to just be this huge character assassination of Odysseus. Margaret Atwood really hates Odysseus, which, you know, from a modern lens is justified because he did a lot of horrible things. And so this, out of all the works that I talked about, is probably the most obviously kind of self-described feminist takedown of ancient Greece. So this one really, like, that's the goal. That's like very obviously what she's going for. And so that's the Penelopiad. And then kind of like similar in subject matter and themes, but very different tonally, which was really interesting to read side by side, is the book Meadowlands by Louise Gluck. And this book is a poetry volume that talks about marital strife through the lens of characters from the Odyssey. And so it's about, you know, a woman who knows that her husband is cheating on her with people, and she is like Penelope and he is Odysseus. And there's like more ambivalence here because there's kind of this huge dissonance between modern marriage and modern like gender expectations and marital constructions juxtaposed to those of the ancient world, which were just so wildly different in ancient Greece than they are today, that this retelling like obviously doesn't make sense perfectly, but it kind of sits in that like ambivalence comfortably, which is really interesting. And so what I want to say about like all three of these texts kind of together, because they all concern the Homeric myths, is that they really exhibit that ambivalence I was referring to earlier. Because on the one hand, they are very critical of, especially like the behavior of men and the treatment of women in these texts, but at the same time, they do kind of reaffirm the importance of the Homeric epics because they demonstrate like that these works have themes which survive the test of time, which is why they are still canonized. And so they kind of offer this new way of like critiquing the canon while also embracing the elements of it that are useful, which is kind of the whole point and demonstrates like my main thesis very well. So another book that I read is a book of poetry by Natalie Diaz, who is a Mexican-American and Native American queer woman author. And When My Brother Was an Aztec is a book that is about her experience with her brother's dependence on methamphetamine and how that affected her family, which is like kind of an exploration of trauma that is very specific to the experiences of a lot of Indigenous women in the United States. She constructs this idea of mythology in the book that overhauls the canon in that it kind of creates this very comprehensive notion of like what culture is and how people build it. So rather than having like one text that she's rewriting, she basically talks about ancient Greece, the Bible, Barbie, Geronimo, ancient Aztec and Indigenous mythology, Harry Houdini, Jimi Hendrix, Sisyphus, just all of these like seemingly dissonant elements of characters and figureheads and literature, just all acting together in tandem as a way of processing her experiences. And so it's like this bricolage approach to culture is what we would say in anthropology, where it's like this combination of disparate elements into this one thing. And that kind of like knocks the canon off its pedestal and demonstrates its importance and its value, while also not like refusing to give it more respect than any other like cultural formation. And this poem is referring to the character of Antigone from the Greek plays of Sophocles. So yeah, that's what that excerpt is from. And then finally, I talked about Hold Your Own by Kay Tempest, which is my favorite poetry book of all time. So when I talk about this, it's less academic and more just me geeking out because I love this book so much. So basically, Hold Your Own is a poetry book by a non-binary poet, Kay Tempest. And it is a retelling of the story of Tiresias. And Tiresias was a blind prophet, so he couldn't physically see, but he had the sight. He was born as a man, but he lived many years as a woman and then transformed back into a man. And so kind of similar to like the general theme of ambivalence throughout my research, he's this like liminal creature that exists in all these different spaces. He exists between the gods and the humans, between man and woman, between sight and blindness, past and future. And so they are kind of able to layer that with their own story as a person who exists like on the margins of gender or between genders, or like oscillating between like different gendered expectations throughout their life. And so what I find really, really amazing about this poetry book is it's like refusal to sacrifice nuance for accessibility's sake, or vice versa. It really like makes this like classics subject matter so accessible, because K Tempest is a freestyle rapper, and like how they got their start was spoken word poetry and learning how to freestyle in South London. And so it's like the language throughout the whole book is so understandable, but it's so fascinatingly constructed. And there's also like this kind of bold assertion throughout the book that like queerness has always existed, but it refuses to label itself as anything of a specific term as like non-binary. And so it's like this acknowledgement that like queerness existed in the ancient world, but not necessarily in the terms that we might use today. While also kind of stating that like K Tempest as a person has always existed, and like their identity has always existed in like these various forms of like gender subversion. And that's a really important part of kind of reassessing the canon, because ancient Greece was very patriarchal, but it was also much less strict about things like gender binary and like our modern notions about heterosexuality that were like more part of the Christianization of Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Tangent. So basically, this is like rewriting in my opinion, like the most comprehensive form. It kind of combines this element of like asserting the importance of the canon and like disrespecting the academy and elitism at the same time, and really like embracing all of this like dissonance and duality and ambivalence that I've talked about with all of these other texts. So yeah, this has been my excuse to talk about some of my favorite poetry and you know, give it a like academic theme. And I just think that like rewriting is always so interesting because it's never simple. It's always like this complex process of, you know, knocking something off its pedestal while also embracing its qualities and critiquing and celebrating at the same time, which is just such a fascinating way of viewing the canon and viewing media. So yeah, that's that's everything I have. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Amelia. Poetry snaps for Amelia, thank you. All right, so our last presenter today is Jack Dinovitz. And Jack, sorry, hold on a sec, is an English major, and they will be talking about the taxidermic angel, the patriarchal use of the female voice in poetry. Please welcome Jack.
Sorry, I'm trying to get this to work. Share screen. Okay. Sorry. There we go. Oh my gosh. I'm sorry, the PowerPoint is not working. This is embarrassing. Okay, let's see.
Stand by.
stand by, please. Yeah, it says hold shift. Okay. My PowerPoint might not be able to work.
I think you can put it in show slideshow. Do you know that button, Jack?
No. Is it on here?
It'll be on the PowerPoint, and then you just share your screen with it.
Okay. Did that work?
Not yet, but maybe you didn't share your screen because your screen isn't shared.
Okay. Let me go. I apologize, everyone. I'm trying to figure this out, and it is not working. Okay.
So you go
Share
down, you see that little green button, you share your screen, you click it and do desktop 1.
Yes, it says desktop 1, and then it says open system preferences and security.
Huh.
Okay. And I made such a good slideshow. Okay.
Well, it's all right. You can just, I guess, read us the slideshow and
Okay. Well, you guys will have to look at my face, I guess. But I will keep trying to get this to work, but I don't think it's going to work. I will send the slideshow to anyone who wants it.
you can send it to me, Jack, and I can also try to share it if you want to email it to me.
Oh, do you mind? Oh, that would be great. Actually, I apologize. This is making everyone stay over. Okay, so let's send the slideshow. I should have thought of that first. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Okay. In the meantime, I hope everyone's having a great end of the year. Yes, I am so excited to teach you guys about my topic. Okay, here we go. And okay, I think I can send it. Perfect. Okay, it's sending.
Right.
Oh, come on, please send. Okay, it is.
In the meantime, let me just look real quick. Mia's got a question. Are there classical characters whose narratives you haven't seen yet, given the kind of quality overhaul you've seen done in the poems you worked with in your study? And if so, which ones would you be most excited to see given the treatment in the future? Amelia, you're typing your answer right now, but you just want to answer for us?
Yeah, I can just say it. I mean, I'm trying to like think off the top of my head. There's a really interesting feminist kind of revision of the Medusa myth that says that like Athena was protecting Medusa against rape, basically, as opposed to like the idea that it was a punishment of Medusa. And I think that's more of an idea in like pop culture. I've never seen it in like poetry form. I think that would be really cool. I wrote about Artemis in one of my poems. This is a portrait of Artemis that I have in my room. And I would love to see like a deconstruction of her, because it was like she was a virgin goddess, but her like mythos kind of shows a lot about like how different the ancient Greek notion of like virginity was, and how it related to things like gender, because it's like so not like the same as kind of our like Christianized idea of virginity. And yeah, those are the ones I can think of. The Spartans are really like wild. They had a lot of weird gender stuff. there's so much. And honestly, I would like more gender overhauls of the Bible, but that's like, that's a different subject entirely.
All right, thanks. All right, so Jack, I've got it on my screen, so let me try to share it, and then you can just talk through it, okay? So here, can everyone see that? All right, so go ahead, Jack.
Okay. So let me, yes, okay. So basically, I decided to make my presentation on something I like to call the taxidermic angel. And this is something that I have seen throughout many different poets, male poets, that use women as a body rather than a ideology of what actual womanhood is. And if we can go on the background part, the next slide. And then my love for this subject stemmed from my mom, and she basically read to me the story of Jane Eyre when she was in her master's program. And she explained to me one day when she started crying that she never felt like she was Jane Eyre, but rather she felt like Bertha Antoinetta Mason, which is like the woman kept in the attic, like within my dad's family, who's very patriarchal, and I'm not afraid to say that. And she explained to me how women through society, I was probably 10, that they are deemed as have to be these perfect women and people, and they have to fit within these parameters of being this perfect angel. And then I basically, ever since then, have always been passionate about feminism. I came out as non-binary. I really understand, like, I'm trying to understand everything as much as I can about what it means for equality. And I really created this thesis because of my amazing teacher, Lou, who really inspired me when she would read poets or tell us to read poets about stuff in our class. And this is my thesis. It's male poets have used the female voice, depicting the Madonna whore complex in narrative poetry to promote patriarchal ideologies through three major lenses of women: biblical imagery, the cult of domesticity, and the death of women. Next slide, please. So basically, I want to start with biblical imagery, and specifically the Madonna whore complex. So for those who do not know, the Madonna whore complex is this ideology that women can either be the Madonna or the whore. And this has been shown throughout history. And my biggest representation of this is Lilith and Eve. And for those who don't know, I'm going to read a quick excerpt. The prime example of this historic juxtaposition between women began with the creation story of Eden with Lilith and Eve. For those who may not know, mythologically speaking, Lilith is considered to be the first wife of Adam, created from the same dirt as Adam rather than from his rib. When Adam demanded that when the two of them have sex for the first time, he demanded her subservience and she refused, and she was then cursed and kicked out of Eden. God then created Eve from Adam's rib to create a more subservient woman for him. And this is something that we see usually within mythology outside of the Torah, because Lilith was spoken about outside of the Torah. My dad is Jewish, so I have learned a lot about this stuff. And yes, and rather than Lilith being seen as someone who stood up for herself, she is deemed as a whore, and in many cases, the devil's concubine. And this is something that we see a lot with older writers in the 1800s, where they would take Lilith and make her into this demonic being, usually with lust, usually with red hair, usually lusting or being narcissistic. And for example, this is the next slide. I want to show you guys Dante Rossetti's poem called Lady Lilith. And this is the poem he wrote, if you guys want to get a quick little read over that. And throughout the opening stanza, we can obviously see he's very misogynistic, and he takes this woman, and he actually paints the poem. He does paint a poem, but he paints the painting, and he writes the poem alongside one another. And he explained that the witch he loved before the gift of Eve. And this is something that really stood out to me when I read this poem, because Lilith refused to give in sexually, so she longs for herself within this, which is very narcissistic. And he's showing that a beautiful woman cannot be seen as both beautiful and not as like a siren or a temptress. Rossetti also painted this painting, like I said, and it depicts her glaring upon herself, which is allowing the male viewer to look upon her as well, while she is not looking at the male viewers, which is very voyeuristic. And you can see that her almost her breast is almost showing, her décolleté is showing, and it's very striking. And this is a very famous painting as well, and which further depicts the Madonna whore complex within biblical imagery. Okay, so now on to the next section of my LOI. Cult of domesticity. Oh, I sent in the wrong PowerPoint, but that's fine. I can do this. But so the cult of domesticity was something basically created in the 1800s, where they made Gaudi, something like that. Gaudi made a Gaudi's woman's book, which is something mothers would give to their daughters before their wedding night. And it would tell their daughters specifically how to act as a woman. And this idea of womanhood was passed down mostly within upper class white women. And it would force them to basically stay uneducated and be this perfect angel in the house. When this is actually where it was created because of Coventry Patmore, who is a very not a very nice man. He, as you can see, he writes, "Man must be pleased, but him to please is woman's pleasure." And he wrote this poem called "The Angel in the House" to explain how his wife loves to please him and he has to do nothing for his wife, and that she looks at him with pitying eyes. And this pissed off Virginia Woolf very badly, very, very badly. And on to the next slide. Virginia Woolf writes this essay in particular to say that the only way in which a woman can be free is killing the angel in the house. And the quote right there says, "Killing the angel in the house was part of the occupation of a woman writer." And I found this to be very striking. And she further explains that her entire life she's been fighting hard to kill the angel in the house. And ultimately, this is a trigger warning for suicide, but Virginia Woolf did take her own life. And yeah, and it's very, personally, when I was writing this, I became very emotional because she was not able to save herself. And one of the only ways in her mind that she explained to save the angel in the house was take autonomy back for herself. And that was ending her own life because a man would not be able to do it for her, which is very, very sad. So now I want to move on to death. And death is seen throughout countless times throughout poetry. It's in the forefront of poems since the beginning of poetry itself. One of the most famous aspects of poetry is male writers writing women, these perfect ideologies of women, and basically then dying, and then the male writers mourning them. This can be seen with Lady of Shalott, with Alfred Lord Tennyson, Annabel Lee, with Edgar Allan Poe, who married who's a creep anyway, sorry to anyone who likes him, and many other aspects within this ideology. But there's one person in particular that took this ideology of death and turned it on its head, and that is Christina Rossetti, which is the next slide. And Christina Rossetti is actually Dante Rossetti's sister, who wrote Lady Lilith. But the amazing thing about Christina Rossetti is many scholars believe that Christina Rossetti is actually a lesbian, and that she was unable to be a lesbian within her society, like openly, obviously, because this is the 1800s. Oh, yes. And she basically wrote this epic poem called Goblin Market. And within this poem, she explains, I'll explain the story a little bit. So the story takes place between two women. Laura becomes very sick and Lizzie must go to the market. there is a heavy allusion to sexual assault with Lizzie with the goblins, and they basically tear her apart and spit this juice in her mouth. And instead of Lizzie dying, which was insinuated in the story, she then goes back and actually saves Laura by kissing her. And this is a quote from that. Like a foam-topped waterspout cast down headlong in the sea, she fell at last, pleasure past and anguish past. It is death, or is it life? Life out of death. And instead of going into the ideology that women have to be dead in order to be seen as a figurehead in poetry, she then said that you can make life out of death rather than death itself for women. And Goblin Market is written by a woman who I've said who saves another woman, which is very powerful, specifically during this time period when you have Lady of Shalott and other ones where beautiful women are seen as strong people. So in conclusion, I want to say, first of all, that we as a society must teach about female characters written by female characters, just the same way we teach about queer writers, teaching queer characters. With many minority groups, this is very important because it adds depth and it allows the people to speak their own story, which is something that I have learned about in Lou's class, which is why I'm writing this, and it's so important to my heart. And throughout history, women in poetry have been put on a pedestal, laced with lie, told to remain silent, the words of patriarchal men, the arsenic and the borax lining the skin of them. And lastly, the only way women in poetry will ever be shown equally as characters and as writers is if more female and non-binary people decide to write poems about the strength of femininity. And if more institutions like the university in which I currently am writing this paper celebrate diversity and teach of its rich depth and honesty, equality will be seen coming soon after. So this was my LOI. I'm sorry that it was a little bit of a mess at first, but that is my LOI, and I hope you all enjoyed it.
All right, snaps for Jack. Thanks, everybody. So we have a few Q&As, and if the audience has questions, they can definitely type them into the Q&A section, and we'll ask them in kind. But I guess I'm just interested in, I mean, I know Hailey sort of mentioned this in her first talk, but like, how did this LOI journey kind of affect your own creative practice, your own writing? Because this is a two-term sort of process. So, I mean, when you read something, it kind of always kind of seeps into your own practice. I'm just wondering, how did this affect your own writing, doing your particular LOI? And maybe we could start with Hailey.
Yeah, sort of like I mentioned, it's always been like a topic of interest for me, thinking about young womanhood and that sort of like experience with coming into your creative voice and how we can encourage that creative voice to be sustained and to evolve. But just kind of like the LOI process in general, I really enjoyed, because I think, whenever you like are able to pick a topic and like you have so much freedom for like what you want to do, it was a really good opportunity for me to go deeper into that question. And like I kind of started to mention too, I like throughout my essay sort of like reference like my old journal writings, and that was a really fun experience too. Just kind of, this is like very personal to my LOI, I guess, but it helped me reflect on sort of where I've been as a writer and kind of remember the inspirations and the things and the people that make me want to write, and sort of like ground me in that. But in general, yeah, really like fun and interesting research process, and really rewarding as a writer.
Cool. What about you, Amelia?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of like similar sentiments. I think like, first of all, having to write this LOI and just like generally going through the KIDD program, I definitely like notice things in poems now that I never would have noticed before. Like I didn't even know what enjambment was until this year. And it's just like really cool. It's kind of like learning a language where you just like pick up on that skill of like noticing details that you know you wouldn't like see on the first read through, but if they weren't there, then you would notice because like something would be wrong with the poem. I noticed that happening a few times while I was analyzing the works in my LOI. So that's one thing that I've gained. I think on a more personal note, this is like this is kind of heavy. But the poem that like kicked off my inspiration for this LOI is one I wrote where I compare myself to Artemis. And I was talking about my experience with sexual assault. And it was like basically my first time like fully admitting to myself what had happened to me and like processing it through that poem. And I happened to like use this lens of ancient Greek mythology because I definitely dressed up as Athena and went to school like that in 4th grade. Like I've always been obsessed with it. And like writing this whole LOI and, you know, having like this community of poets and like making the work that I've made this year has helped me like deal with my own trauma in such a profound and intense way that I don't think would have been possible without KIDD. So yeah, that's really intense and personal, but that's like definitely one of the biggest takeaways that I've gotten from this project and this program. So yeah.
That's awesome, Amelia. Jack, what about you?
For me, this LOI means the world to me. It actually helped me realize in a lot of ways that basically the way that this started was in the beginning of this term in my class, I wrote a poem from the point of view of someone who was not in a man's body or a man's body. And I realized that I am non-binary. And that was a huge awakening for me specifically. And the KIDD program, who would have known, actually like helped me a lot, like realize like who I am as a person, what that means. And specifically with my LOI, I wanted to really understand how womanhood was seen as something so either innocent or evil and within these poets. And I remembered what my mom said about Jane Eyre within her own writing, and I actually wrote a poem about that said that combined Jane Eyre and Pride and Prejudice, and basically said that yeah, and it was an amazing poem. And after writing that poem, I knew I wanted to write an LOI that had to do with womanhood and how men manipulate the female voice in order to gain privilege or gain power over women.
And did it affect your own writing? Like, how did it?
Yes, sorry, it did affect my own writing. I realized that my perspective of writing, like I can only write from what I know. I learned this from this LOI because of specifically if I do not know what it's like to be a different race or be anything like different than myself, I don't feel comfortable writing from that perspective anymore. I used to think it was okay, and after doing this LOI and really jumping into what it means to be a writer, writing from my own, I started writing from my own perspectives and my own self, and the LOI truly like helped me understand that like who is supposed to write what kind of poem and what that means to the readers as well.
Cool, thanks, Jack. All right, so this next question comes from Michael Wilson, and it's for Hailey. You said that Plath and Sexton were able to utilize poetics to help reach towards, quote, that unspeakability in regards to taboo subjects, specifically surrounding mental health. Why poetics? Plath also has her novel. What if Sexton wrote a memoir rather than poetry? Or they both are as novelists? What specifically does poetics as an art form provide towards that unspeakability? Hard question, Michael. Good one though. Go ahead.
It's a
Andi.
good one though. I was like, that's a great question, because I think about that question of why poetry and what sets it apart a lot too. And I think it's definitely very important to this LOI. And I think one of the reasons would be sort of what I talked about like the implicit like tools of poetics that happen within a poem, where you have the ability to create an atmosphere or create like sensations for the audience in a poem that aren't necessarily like written on the page, and it's there as a tool to help people sort of like experience what you're experiencing emotionally and also just like physically, like going through your body. So I feel like to be able to describe and put a situation down on paper into a poem, and have that be able to have this like sort of superpower of like helping or of making people that read it feel the way you feel, is I think distinctly validating and important for, like I was talking about, like de-isolating the experience. And then another thing too that I was thinking about is for like being able to speak the unspeakable, or like talk about your experience with mental health maybe for the first time. I think the ability that poetry offers like uniquely to come into new voices and new tones, and maybe adopt a speaker persona that's close to your heart but maybe is also like a little bit different. The ways that you can play around with it specifically in poetry, which you can do in like novels and other forms of writing as well, but specifically in poetry, how you can really make that voice something that's like strong and important and a leading factor in your poem, I think is really helpful for a lot of people who feel maybe hesitant to speak their experience for the first time. They know that they have that as a tool, how they can kind of like sort of like step into a different persona almost. And there's a lot more like experimenting, I think, that can happen with poetics, which I think is really important. And then also, finally, I just think that there's a reason that we turn to poetry and poetics in like a lot of our times of deep emotion. You know, there's a reason why we have all these poems and songs for holidays and for birthdays, or in times of great tragedy, why poetry becomes so important, or in times of great change throughout American history, why there have been poetic movements that follow social movements. Because there's something about musicality and rhythm and the use of poetics to create a different voice and a different energy that I think is just uniquely tied to our souls in some way that I don't think we can really explain today, but it gets to our hearts in a way that I think is very special and important, which is why I think it's really important to encourage young people to experiment with that.
All right, you passed the test. You passed Michael's. That was a great response. And yeah, if anyone else has more questions, please put them in the Q&A section. I guess I'll ask Amelia that same kind of question. I mean, what does poetics offer retelling of myth, and that maybe isn't available in other forms?
So it doesn't. There are plenty of novels and like translations of text that do functionally a lot of very similar stuff to the poetry that I talked about. For instance, like Madeline Miller is a very famous, successful novelist who writes like retellings of classical stories from the canon. So I have to admit that it's partly, this is a poetry thing, and so I was writing about poetry. But there are like specific elements of poetry from classics that are utilized a lot by these authors. So like, for instance, I mentioned the Greek chorus in Margaret Atwood's book. And so you have this like this rhetorical method in ancient Greek plays where rather than just having all the information conveyed through like normal human dialogue or what we normally see in like movies, for instance, these days, you just have like this faceless group who like provides the narrative. And this was like very deeply gendered. If you look at like a more like male coded Greek chorus, there's a lot more agency and authority. And like the female coded chorus was a lot more passive. I wrote about that in like one of the papers that I used for like my research. And so she specifically took like this very like distinctly female chorus, and she's doing kind of this really like campy, like over the top extreme version of like the chorus where they're like literally like singing in rhyme, like they read like Dr. Seuss poems. There's even a part where she says that like the slave girls are dressed up as sailors, so they're like performing in male drag to like talk about like what the men are experiencing. And like I don't think any of that would have been as like effective as the Greek chorus. It also I think poetry and song have an ability to convey a lot of information and a lot of like dense emotionality much quicker than prose does. And so it like condenses a lot of those like points into like a much quicker, wittier, like kind of small package type of thing. And then there's also the fact that like the Homeric myths, for instance, were epic poems. And the poetry of like Homer's work has been extensively studied. And so there's a lot to do with like the use of poetry there. And I think Memorial is the best example of that, because she basically took Homer's rhetorical device of the simile and like the descriptor and like took it to an extreme. Because if you read the Odyssey and the Iliad, there are tons of similes, and everybody has like a descriptor that gets repeated over and over. So every time a character is reintroduced in the text, it gets like the same adjective basically every time. And so she basically took all of the like similes and descriptors from the Iliad and pulled them out and made them into like a poem in its own right. And she said that in one of her lectures that they almost create like this hallucinated poem or this ghost poem that's like floating above the Iliad. And so I don't think like a lot of what I have to say is like unique to poetry, but the way that like these poets utilize the medium is definitely notable, and it has like a wildly different impact than novels do.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I'm a novelist, so I hope that each form offers its own attributes that are good, but you made a good case for poetry. Cool. Oh, here's another one. Amelia, I loved your breakdown of Greek myth tropes and the revisionist work that many folks are currently undertaking. Earlier in your presentation, you discussed of the canon brought to mind the decolonization of the canon that is starting to make its way through academic syllabi. What writers then do we start to bench? That's a good term, Michael. Woodworth, Eliot, etc. Who decides, or are those entirely the wrong questions to ask?
I don't know if I mean, I don't want to like fully admit that I just don't know the answer to this. I don't know if like I'm the right person to ask. I think that like a lot of the time when I'm asked questions like this, my knee-jerk reaction is like, well, education should be free. Like that's like, let's solve that problem first before we even talk about like overhauling the canon. Like education generally should just be like more accessible and affordable. And I kind of think that like if you make those things affordable and accessible through things like systemic and structural change, then it will follow that the canon will like become decolonized because there will be like more voices and more equity. That's a very like practical answer to kind of a more like philosophical question. But that's like I don't know, that's like the
materialist Marxist point of view. I like it.
Yeah, it was a really Marxist answer to a very non-Marxist question. I think like I don't feel comfortable saying like who should decide or like who the author should be, just because I'm not like, I don't feel like aware enough of like the breadth of like all this different work to like really say like what my canon would be, for instance. But I think that like that's like the answer that I feel comfortable giving is like equity and inclusion, and it will follow that like we can dismantle the canon. So yeah.
Cool. I mean, I guess this question can also be for Jack too, because you're kind of talking about these sort of damaging stereotypes of women and yeah, I mean, what do you think about, this kind of deconstructing the canon for a more feminist point of view?
I agree with Amelia, honestly. I think we should be reading the old text along with the new text within one another. Specifically, when learning about, for example, I mean, if we want to cause controversy, the Bible, reading that as like rewriting the Bible and how that kind of stuff is, specifically with Lilith, and for people who are regaining power with writing Lilith as like this hero aspect, which in the Bible she's barely talked about in the end, and in the Torah she's mentioned only a few times as well. So I feel like I may differ a little bit from Amelia, because I do believe that um, I would love people from now on to look at Lilith as a positive aspect and kind of erase the way that she used to be looked at. But in a way, I do feel that that people should be reading the feminist ideology along with the original, so that way people can come up with their own idea of what the art is as a whole, rather than just as both canon and not canon. But yeah, I hope I answered it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Oh, Lou's got one for Jack. As someone who I know loves persona poems, how has your research factored into change that? You spoke on this a bit already, but I wondered if you could elaborate.
Yes. I love a good persona poem, which my class knows. But I find it research. I want to speak about what I know now. I used to want to write stories about more with more diversity, one would say, and more like distinctions between characters, and really dive into the minds of other people, which I do think is important for writing. But I do see, however, that some of my writing before was more appropriative than it was being authentically myself as a writer. And I acknowledge that, and I learned so much from this program actually about what that means. And specifically with my persona poems, now I write from my perspective as someone who is non-binary, as someone who feels like I can balance between these two ideologies of what manhood and womanhood and neither at the same time kind of encompass. So my persona poems specifically, I've been really trying to write of and kind of within my body and within an idea of the body I long to have, kind of. And it's very interesting, and it's very confusing for myself, and obvious, and maybe for everyone else hearing this, but it's just is what it is. I find it so basically, to answer Lou's question and the long way around is I do believe that my persona poems have changed through the research that I've done. So yeah.
Cool, and this will just be the last question because we're running out of time, and I think Jack sort of answered this, but maybe so this may be for Hailey and Amelia. How is your, now that you've done the KIDD, how has your sort of writing changed to now? Like what is your journey as a writer? And we can start with maybe Hailey can answer this.
Yeah, I can go. Well, I think, yeah, it's my writing has changed a lot. And I find myself like really just like experimenting a lot more. I think I had like sort of an opposite experience where when I started writing, I had like a very strong idea of like what I thought I wanted to be. Like it was very like emulating a lot of my early like inspirations like Plath and Sexton. Like, okay, I'm just gonna write about myself, and like this is the work I'm gonna do. But I feel like through the KIDD and seeing the amazing work of all my peers and learning about new things and the workshop process, and like seeing sort of the questions that are important to think about when you're thinking about like how someone's reading your poem, I've definitely explored with like a lot of different like I mean, people in my class would vouch, like I do a lot with like trying out different forms, and like by the end I was writing these like narrative poems that were just unlike anything I'd ever written. So I'm doing a lot more experimenting, which I think is really good, and I'm like happy for once to be in like a process where like maybe I'm not 100% sure where my voice is or like where my craft will like land as far as like what I want to do like as a writer. But it's a really good experience, and I think I understand now too the importance of just writing and like not trying my best, which I still have a lot of difficulty with, like turning off like the inner critic while you're writing and just trying to stay true to whatever ideas and whatever feelings and sensations are bringing you to the page. But yeah, and that's sort of it in short. It's been a really fun experience.
Yeah, that's a good place to be. I think they call it the gift of not knowing what the hell you're doing. I think that's a good position for artists to be in. Amelia, what about you?
I mean, like, I'm experiencing similar things with like experimenting more. I think like what's been one thing that's been kind of interesting is that I tend to be like a concept to product type of writer where I always like I come up with an idea, like I come up with a notion of like what the poem is going to be, and it's like very structured. And I think like a lot of my classmates value more like sit down and write and just like spill your guts out like on the page type of thing, which is like really hard for me because as soon as I start trying to like be a beat poet and just like go crazy, I start like coming up with like a concept or a structure. And so learning how to do that has been really interesting. I think I've only succeeded in it maybe like once or twice, but that's been really cool. I also think that like there's kind of this like cool balance between like getting form right and getting like rawness correct. And so like, you know, like writing something that that like uses, you know, rhetorical devices and form in like an interesting way, but also like comes from the heart or is like raw and honest. And like doing that at the same time can be tricky because I think a lot of the time, like I really like sticking to form and making something like really campy. And then when I like, when I try being like honest, it's just like a journal entry with line breaks. And I feel like KIDD has kind of like taught me like how to like synthesize that into creating something that like takes the best qualities out of like both of those aspects of poetry. So that's something that like I always consider when writing now.
Cool. All right, those are both good things to know. All right, we're out of time. Thank you so much for all our presenters, Hailey, Amelia, and Jack. Let's give them some poetry snaps because they're all poets. So thank you so much for your great presentation. So our next one is at 1:45 if you can make it. All right, see you then. Thank you so much.